Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story. Chapter 1. The Reluctant Groom. The wedding band felt foreign on Elias Hart's finger as he stood at the back of the reception hall, watching guests celebrate a union he had agreed to but could not embrace. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across the gathering of 200 strangers who had come to witness the joining of the Hart and Noren families. Champagne flowed freely, laughter echoed through the vaulted ceilings, and at the center of it all was Lila, his wife of exactly 6 hours. She moved through the crowd with effortless grace, her wedding dress a masterpiece of ivory lace against her dark skin. When she laughed, guests around her seemed drawn into her orbit, like celestial bodies circling a star. Elias observed her from behind a marble column, his scarred hand tucked into his pocket where no one could see it tremble. "Hiding from your bride already?" The voice belonged to his father, appearing suddenly beside him with 2 tumblers of amber liquid. "Just taking a moment," Elias replied, accepting the offered drink. His father studied him, eyes lingering on the right side of his face where reconstructive surgery had done its best to repair what fire had claimed. "The Norens have honored their commitment. Their daughter is everything they promised, educated, beautiful, from excellent lineage. The question remains whether my son will honor his." Elias took a measured sip of his drink. "I signed the papers." "Marriage is more than papers, Elias. That woman deserves more than a reluctant signature and a cold bed." Before Elias could respond, a flash of ivory in his peripheral vision announced Lila's approach. His father discreetly retreated, leaving them alone. "There you are," Lila said, her Ghanaian accent subtle but musical. "I thought perhaps you had escaped already." Though her tone was teasing, a flicker of genuine concern shadowed her eyes. Up close, Elias could see the intricate patterns shaved into her close-cropped hair, adorned with tiny crystal pins that matched her earrings. Her skin was flawless, unmarked by tragedy or pain. She deserved better than damage. "Just needed air," he said, forcing a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. Lila studied him, her gaze direct in a way that made him want to turn his scarred side away from her. Instead, she surprised him by reaching for his hidden hand, drawing it gently from his pocket. He stiffened but allowed the contact. "In my culture," she said, tracing the ridged skin of his palm with her thumb, "scars are not something to hide. They tell stories of survival." Elias withdrew his hand. "Some stories aren't worth telling." A microphone squealed to life as the wedding coordinator announced the couple's first dance. Lila's eyes held his, a silent question in them. "They're waiting for us," she said. Elias nodded stiffly and offered his arm. They moved to the center of the dance floor, surrounded by eager faces. The music began, a slow jazz number he vaguely recognized. As he placed his hand at her waist, keeping a formal distance between them, he felt her whisper against his ear, "I will not break, Elias Hart." The statement caught him off guard, and for a brief moment he actually looked at her, not as an obligation or a business arrangement, but as a woman who had just tied her life to a stranger. What he saw in her eyes wasn't pity or resignation, but a quiet determination that made him glance away first. The lakeside cabin had been a wedding gift from Lila's parents, nestled in a private cove 2 hours from Seattle. Floor-to-ceiling windows faced the water, framing the North Cascades in the distance. Under different circumstances, it might have been the perfect honeymoon retreat, and Elias carried their luggage inside, while Lila explored the open-concept main floor with its stone fireplace and modern kitchen. Fresh flowers sat in vases throughout the house, a thoughtful touch from the property manager who had stocked the refrigerator and set the heating system to a comfortable temperature before their arrival. "It's beautiful," Lila said, running her hand along the polished granite countertop. She had changed from her wedding dress into a simple sweater and jeans, her wedding jewelry replaced by a single gold band. "Your parents mentioned you enjoy nature. I thought this might be more comfortable than a city apartment." Elias set down the last suitcase. "You chose this place?" She nodded. "I wanted somewhere quiet where we could adjust." A pause, get to know each other. Her consideration only deepened his discomfort. He found himself wishing she had been cold or demanding, anything that would justify the distance he intended to maintain. "I'll take the guest room," he said abruptly, picking up his suitcase again. "You can have the master." He didn't miss the flash of hurt that crossed her features before her expression smoothed into careful neutrality. "As you wish." Later that night, Elias stood in the guest bathroom, studying his reflection in the mirror. Steam from the shower fogged the glass, mercifully blurring the topography of his scars. The damage extended from his right temple down his neck, disappearing beneath his collarbone and spreading across his shoulder and back. The skin was a patchwork of surgeries and skin grafts, a terrain no woman should have to explore. The accident had occurred 2 years ago. He had been driving when a semi-truck jackknifed in front of him on the freeway. His car had struck the fuel tank, erupting into flames. The driver's side had taken the worst of it. The doctors called his survival miraculous. He sometimes thought of it as a curse. His engagement to Layla had been arranged 6 months ago, a continuation of a plan set in motion by their families long before his accident. He had tried to break it, but duty to his family's wishes had prevailed. Lila had never wavered, even after seeing him for the first time post-accident. Her steadfastness had only convinced him that her motives must be tied to family obligation rather than personal desire. A soft knock on the bedroom door interrupted his thoughts. "Elias," Lila's voice came through the door. "I made some tea if you'd like some." He hesitated, then wrapped a towel around his waist, making sure it covered most of his scarred torso, before cracking the door open. "Thank you, but I'm tired. It's been a long day." She stood in the hallway, holding 2 steaming mugs, wearing a silk robe over what appeared to be pajamas. Her face fell slightly at his rejection, but she nodded. "Of course. Rest well, Elias," she called as she turned away. She paused, looking back expectantly. Words failed him as he tried to explain what he couldn't articulate even to himself. Finally, he simply said, "Thank you for understanding." Her smile was gentle, but tinged with sadness. "I understand more than you think, Elias. When you're ready to see that, I'll be here." As the door closed between them, Elias felt a strange tightness in his chest, the first emotional pain he had felt since the accident that wasn't tied to his scars or his lost sense of self. It was something new and unexpected. The realization that in his attempt to spare Leela from a husband she deserved, he might be hurting her in ways he hadn't considered. Still, he told himself as he lay down in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the gentle lapping of lake water against the shore outside. It was better this way. Better she understand now, before expectations could take root, before disappointment could bloom, before either of them could pretend this arrangement was anything but what it was. A marriage of family interests, not hearts. 3 months, he decided, staring at the ceiling. He would give it 3 months, for appearance's sake. Then he would suggest a quiet separation, allowing them both to save face while finding happiness elsewhere. Lila was young, beautiful, brilliant. Without him, without the burden of his damage, she would flourish. The thought should have comforted him. Instead, as sleep finally claimed him, Elias dreamed of jazz music and the whispered certainty of a woman who claimed she would not break. Chapter 2. The Silent Cabin. Morning light filtered through the pines surrounding the lakeside cabin as Lila poured her first cup of coffee. 3 months had passed since the wedding day, and the cabin had settled into a rhythm of quiet coexistence. The calendar on the refrigerator marked 92 days of marriage, 92 breakfasts eaten at different times, 92 nights spent in separate rooms, and conversations that never ventured beyond polite inquiries about the weather or meal preferences. Leela leaned against the kitchen counter, watching the sunrise paint the lake in amber hues. She had grown to love this view, even as the silence of the cabin threatened to suffocate her. Picking up her sketchbook, she added another charcoal stroke to her drawing of the landscape, capturing the way mist clung to the surface of the water in the early hours. The sound of a door opening upstairs alerted her to Elias's awakening. She quickly set aside her sketchbook and busied herself preparing a second cup of coffee, black with 1 sugar, the way he preferred it. Their morning ritual was well established. She would leave his coffee on the counter and retreat to the sunroom before he entered the kitchen, giving him space to begin his day without the awkwardness of forced conversation. Today, however, Lila lingered. She had resolved during the sleepless night that after 3 months of respecting his boundaries, it was time to challenge them. Their arrangement, if it could be called that, was slowly hollowing her out. "Good morning," she said when he appeared in the doorway, dressed in a long-sleeved Henley and jeans, despite the early summer heat. Elias paused, clearly surprised to find her still in the kitchen. "Morning?" he responded, his voice rough from disuse. His eyes darted to the coffee cup waiting for him, then back to her, a question in his gaze. "I thought perhaps we might have breakfast together," Lila said, gesturing to the table, where she had set out fruit, yogurt, and freshly baked bread from the local farmer's market. "It's a beautiful day," conflict played across his features. "I have a conference call at 8. It's 6:30, she pointed out gently. After a moment's hesitation, Elias nodded and took a seat at the table, careful to choose the chair that kept his scarred side away from her. Lila counted it as a small victory. They ate in silence for several minutes before she ventured further. "I spoke with my mother yesterday. She asked how we're settling in." "What did you tell her?" His question held an edge of tension. Lila met his gaze directly. "I told her the cabin is lovely and that you're very busy with work." She sliced a strawberry with more force than necessary. "I didn't tell her that my husband treats me like a roommate he's avoiding owing rent to." Elias set down his coffee cup with a sharp click against the saucer. "I never pretended this would be anything else." "No. You never pretended at all," she agreed, her voice remaining calm despite the frustration simmering beneath. "You made assumptions about what I wanted, what I expected, without ever asking me. It was clear from the arrangement." "The arrangement," she interrupted, "was between our families. What happens between us, Elias, is ours to decide." He looked away, his jawline tightening. "I'm trying to be considerate." "By ignoring me?" She shook her head. "That isn't consideration, it's cowardice." The word hung between them, sharp and undeniable. Elias pushed back from the table, his breakfast half-eaten. "I have work to do." Lila watched him retreat to his study, the door closing firmly behind him. She remained at the table, wondering if she had pushed too hard too soon. Then she reminded herself that 92 days of patience had yielded nothing but more distance. Something needed to change. From his study window, Elias watched Lila walk along the lakeshore, her slender figure silhouetted against the morning light. She wore a simple sundress, her bare feet leaving imprints in the damp sand as she collected smooth stones, examining each before either keeping it or skipping it across the water's surface. He had been unnecessarily curt at breakfast. Her accusation of cowardice had struck too close to a truth he wasn't ready to acknowledge. It was easier to frame his distance as consideration rather than fear. Fear that once the novelty of their arrangement wore off, she would see his scars for what they were, a permanent reminder of damaged goods. Turning away from the window, Elias forced himself to focus on work emails, but his concentration kept fracturing. Fragments of their brief conversation replayed in his mind alongside memories of their equally brief wedding dance. The way she had whispered, "I will not break," as if she had already seen through his carefully constructed walls. Later that afternoon, a knock on his study door pulled him from a video conference. "Just a moment," he called to his colleagues, muting his microphone before opening the door. Lila stood in the hallway, car keys in hand. "I'm going into town for groceries. Is there anything you need?" He noticed she had changed into linen pants and a blouse, her neck adorned with a simple gold necklace. The small gold stud in her nose caught the light when she tilted her head, waiting for his response. "No, thank you," he said, then added, "Drive safely." Something like disappointment flickered across her face before she nodded and turned away. Elias found himself speaking again before he could reconsider. "Actually, we're out of coffee beans. The Ethiopian ones, if they have them." Lila paused, looking back, with the first genuine smile he had seen from her in weeks. "Ethiopian it is." When she had gone, Elias returned to his conference call, but found his thoughts drifting to the way her smile had transformed her face, revealing a dimple in her left cheek he hadn't noticed before. It occurred to him that in 3 months of marriage, he knew virtually nothing about his wife beyond her coffee preferences and her penchant for early morning walks. The realization should have reinforced his determination to maintain distance. Instead, it left him with an unexpected hollow sensation in his chest. Evening found Lila in the sunroom, a space she had gradually claimed as her own over the past months. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with the literature and academic texts she had brought from her previous life in Accra. A drafting table stood near the windows, covered with sketches of native plants she had documented on her walks through the surrounding forest. She was reading when the door opened, causing her to look up in surprise. Elias stood in the doorway, hesitant. "May I come in?" he asked, as if she might deny him access to a room in his own home. She nodded, setting aside her book. "Of course." He entered, carrying 2 mugs, and handed one to her. The rich aroma of the Ethiopian coffee she had purchased filled the space between them. "Thank you," she said, accepting the offering with a curious glance. In 3 months, this was the first time he had sought her out after dinner. Elias took a seat in the armchair opposite hers, his posture rigid. "I owe you an apology for this morning." Lila sipped her coffee, giving herself time to consider her response. "You don't owe me anything, Elias, but I appreciate the gesture." "You were right," he said, surprising her further. "I have been avoiding you. It's not fair." She studied him over the rim of her mug, noting the way he held himself, always angled, so the scarred side of his face remained in shadow. "May I ask you something personal?" His hesitation was visible, but he nodded. "The accident," she began carefully. "How long ago was it?" 2 years, 1 month, and 16 days, he answered, without needing to calculate, the precision telling her how deeply the date was etched into his consciousness. "Were you alone?" "Yes." His grip tightened on his mug. "Truck accident on I-5. My car caught fire." Lila absorbed this information, connecting it with the patterns of scarring she had glimpsed on their wedding night. "The doctors did remarkable work." A bitter laugh escaped him. "That's a polite way of putting it." "I wasn't being polite," she countered. "I was being honest. You're still here. That's remarkable." Silence settled between them again, but it felt different from the usual strained quiet, more contemplative than oppressive. Finally, Elias asked a question of his own. "Why did you agree to this arrangement? You could have refused." Lila considered deflecting, but decided truth was the only path forward. If they were ever to move beyond this impasse, "I was curious about the man my parents described. Brilliant, principled, with vision beyond his years." She smiled slightly. "I've always been drawn to minds that see the world differently." "That was before," he said, his voice low. "Before what?" "The accident?" she challenged. "Do you think scars changed your mind, Elias?" He didn't answer, but the tightening of his expression told her she had struck a nerve. Lila leaned forward. "I didn't marry your face or your unblemished skin. Those were never offered to me." "What was offered was a lie," he countered. "A version of me that no longer exists." "Then show me who exists now," she said simply. "Because all I've seen for 3 months is a man hiding in his own home from his own wife." Elias set down his mug and stood, the conversation clearly pushing him beyond his comfort zone. "It's getting late." Lila didn't try to stop him as he moved toward the door, but she called after him softly. "I meant what I said at our wedding, Elias. I will not break. The question is, will you ever allow yourself to bend?" He paused in the doorway, his back to her, shoulders tense beneath his shirt. For a moment, she thought he might turn around, might finally face her fully. Instead, he nodded once, an acknowledgement without commitment, and continued down the hallway to his separate bedroom. Lila remained in the sunroom long after he had gone, watching moonlight ripple across the lake's surface. 3 months of marriage to a stranger who feared being seen. But tonight, for the first time, he had sought her out, had brought her coffee, had asked her a question that suggested he might be wondering who she was, beyond the arrangement that had brought them together. It wasn't much, but it was something, a crack in the wall, and Lila Noren Hart had always been patient when pursuing something worthwhile. Lila traced her finger along the spines of vinyl records housed in a forgotten cabinet beneath the living room window. The discovery had been accidental. She'd been searching for additional blankets as the mountain nights grew cooler, but instead found a collection of jazz albums gathering dust. She pulled one out, admiring the vintage cover art of a smoky club with a saxophonist silhouetted against blue stage lights. "Miles Davis Quintet," she read aloud, blowing dust from the sleeve before carefully extracting the vinyl. The cabin's previous owners had left behind a record player that Lila had assumed was merely decorative. Now she examined it with renewed interest, finding it in working order, despite years of disuse. She placed the record on the turntable and lowered the needle with delicate precision. The first notes crackled through the speakers, a melancholy saxophone backed by subtle piano. The sound quality imperfect, but somehow more authentic for its flaws. Lila closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. There was something familiar about the melody, something that tugged at her memory. "What are you doing?" She turned to find Elias in the doorway, briefcase in hand, having returned from a rare day at his Seattle office. His expression was more curious than accusatory. "I found these records," she explained, gesturing to the cabinet. "This one seemed familiar somehow." Elias set down his briefcase and approached cautiously, as if the music might burn him. His eyes fell on the album cover, and his expression transformed. Recognition, followed by a quick shuddering of emotion. "The Seattle Foundation Gala," he said quietly. 4 years ago, this was the band." Lila's eyes widened as the memory clicked into place. "You were there!" "So were you." The revelation hung between them, a shared moment from before the accident, before the arrangement, before the silence. Lila had attended the gala with her father during her first visit to Seattle, a fundraiser for scientific education. She remembered glimpsing Elias across the room, engaged in animated conversation with researchers, his gestures passionate as he described some concept beyond her hearing. "I saw you there," she admitted. "You were talking about sustainable technology. You seemed so whole." His voice held a bitter edge. "Alive," she corrected. "Pat, the same way you sound when you're on your video conferences and forget to close your office door." A flash of surprise crossed his features, quickly masked. "You listen to my calls?" "Not intentionally," she assured him. "But sound carries in this cabin. Sometimes I hear your voice when you're explaining concepts to colleagues." She hesitated before adding, "I like how you sound then, like yourself." Elias looked away, uncomfortable with her observation. The record continued to play, filling the silence between them with notes that evoked crystal chandeliers and polished dance floors. "Would you like dinner?" Lila asked, changing the subject. "I made lamb stew. It's my grandmother's recipe." He nodded, following her to the kitchen, where the rich aroma of slowly simmered meat and spices filled the air. The music continued to drift through the open space, creating an atmosphere different from their usual quiet meals. They ate at the kitchen island, the formality of the dining table abandoned for proximity to the warmth of the stove. "This is excellent," Elias commented after several bites, the genuine appreciation in his voice causing Lila to smile. "My grandmother insisted I learn to cook before I left Ghana," she explained. "She said a woman should know how to nourish herself, regardless of whether she cooked for others." "She sounds wise." She was. Lila's voice softened with memory. "She raised me after my mother died. I was 10. Elias looked up, surprise evident in his expression. "I didn't know your mother had passed." "There's a lot we don't know about each other," Lila pointed out gently. "That was your choice." He had no response to that, returning his attention to his meal. But the dynamic between them had evolved. A small piece of her history now belonged to him, whether he had sought it or not. After dinner, Lila moved to clear the dishes, but Elias stopped her with a light touch on her wrist, the first voluntary contact he had initiated since their wedding day. "Let me," he said, withdrawing his hand quickly, but not before she felt the rough texture of scar tissue against her skin. "You cooked." "Thank you," she said, stepping back to allow him access to the sink. She watched as he rolled up his sleeves, just enough to avoid getting them wet, careful to keep his forearms covered. The record had finished playing, leaving the cabin in silence once more. Making a decision, Lila returned to the living room and selected another album from the collection. This one featured a vocalist with a smoky contralto that spilled into the kitchen like warm honey. When she returned, Elias was drying the last of the dishes, his movements methodical. "Dance with me," she said suddenly. He froze, dish towel suspended in midair. "What?" "Dance with me," she repeated, extending her hand. "Just once. I don't dance anymore." His refusal was immediate, his body language closing off. "You danced at our wedding," she reminded him. That was different. It was expected. Lila didn't lower her hand. "And this is just a dance, Elias. Not a commitment, not a surrender, just movement to music." He regarded her outstretched hand as if it might contain both salvation and poison. The vocalist crooned about moonlight and missed chances, her voice weaving between piano notes with practiced precision. "Please, Leela added softly. One dance, the request resonated, breaking through his initial resistance. After another moment's hesitation, Elias set down the dish towel and stepped toward her. He didn't take her hand, but he moved into the open space of the kitchen, maintaining a careful distance. Hold me while I dance, then, Leela amended, understanding his boundaries. She began to sway to the music, close enough that he could feel her presence, but not so near that he would feel trapped. Slowly, awkwardly, Elias began to move as well, his rhythm stiff, but gradually finding synchronicity with hers. They danced without touching, like planets in separate orbits, aware of each other's gravity but maintaining their distance. As the song progressed, Leela closed her eyes, losing herself in the music and the moment, this small victory of shared space. When she opened them again, she found Elias watching her, his expression unguarded for once. There was something in his gaze she hadn't seen before, not pity or resignation or polite detachment, but genuine curiosity. Emboldened, she moved slightly closer, still not touching but decreasing the careful gap between them. His eyes flickered with momentary panic, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he extended his hand, his left, the unscarred one, into the space between them. Leila's breath caught in her throat. She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his palm against hers. They continued to sway, connected now by this single point of contact, his grip tentative, as if ready to release her at the first sign of discomfort. "See," she said softly, "the world didn't end." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first she had seen since their wedding day. Not yet. The song drew to a close, its final notes fading into the stillness of the cabin. For 3 heartbeats they remained connected, hands linked in the space between their bodies. Then Elias gently disengaged, stepping back to reinstate the distance he seemed to require. "Thank you for dinner," he said formally, as if the dance hadn't happened, as if they hadn't just shared the most intimate moment of their 3-month marriage. "And for the music." Leila nodded, recognizing that pushing further tonight would undo the progress they had made. "Good night, Elias." He disappeared down the hallway to his room, leaving her alone in the kitchen with the echo of music still hanging in the air. Leila returned to the record player and carefully placed the vinyl back in its sleeve, her fingertips lingering on the cover art. Tonight marked a breakthrough, not dramatic but significant, like the first hairline crack in a dam that had held back an ocean. In his room, Elias sat on the edge of his bed, his heart pounding as if he had run a marathon, rather than simply swayed to music in his own kitchen. His hand, the hand that had held hers, tingled with the memory of warm skin against his palm. He hadn't intended to dance with her. He hadn't intended to share any part of himself beyond what propriety demanded. Yet something about the music, about the memory it evoked of a time before his life had shattered into before and after, had weakened his resolve. And Leila, she had looked at him, not Alex with pity or revulsion, but with a simple desire for connection. When she closed her eyes and moved to the music, her face had relaxed into an expression of pure enjoyment, as if dancing in the kitchen with a reluctant partner was exactly where she wanted to be. It made no sense to him. She was young, beautiful, educated. She could have had anyone. Why would she accept an arrangement with a man whose body and spirit had been equally scarred by fire? He thought back to what she had revealed over dinner, that she had lost her mother as a child, that her grandmother had raised her. Small pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was trying to solve. Who was this woman who had entered his life through arrangement, but refused to be treated as a transaction? Elias caught sight of his reflection in the dresser mirror and quickly looked away. A habitual aversion. Then, forcing himself to look back, he studied what Leila must see when he looked at him. The jagged line that ran from his temple down his cheek, the uneven texture of his right jaw, where grafted skin had never quite matched the original. The scarring continued down his neck, across his shoulder, and along his right arm to the wrist. A map of the worst day of his life, permanently etched into his flesh. The doctors had called it remarkable that he had retained full mobility. They praised the success of the grafts, the minimal contracture, the way his body had accepted the treatments. All Elias had seen was a ruined landscape where his former self had once resided. Yet tonight, when Leila had looked at him while they danced, he had seen neither disgust nor pity in her eyes, just presence, acceptance, and something else he couldn't quite name. but that had compelled him against all his carefully constructed defenses to reach for her hand. Elias flexed his fingers, remembering the warm weight of her palm against his. Such a small thing, a hand offered and accepted, yet it felt monumental, as if some fundamental boundary had been crossed. He thought of what she had said at their wedding, "I will not break," and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that perhaps she wouldn't, that perhaps the fragility he had projected onto her existed only in his mind, a reflection of his own broken self-image rather than any weakness in her. The realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. If Leela was stronger than he had assumed, what other assumptions might he have been wrong about? Sleep eluded him that night, as the question echoed in his mind, accompanied by the phantom sensation of her hand in his, and the memory of jazz notes floating through the cabin that had for the first time felt like something other than a beautiful prison. Chapter 3. Second Signal. The Poetry Night. A week after their dance, Lila discovered the leather-bound journal while organizing the bookshelf in the sunroom. It had fallen behind a row of technical manuals, its spine cracked from years of use. She hadn't meant to open it, respecting Elias's privacy, but when it fell from her hands, the pages fanned open to reveal handwritten verses. Poetry. Elias's poetry. Judging by the dates in the margins, all from before the accident, his handwriting flowed across the pages in disciplined lines, articulating thoughts on nature, time, and the fragility of human connection. Lila quickly closed the journal, but not before a particular stanza caught her eye. "In the spaces between words I find you, not in what is said but in what remains, unspoken, like air between outstretched hands, that never quite touch." The words resonated with a truth about their current situation that made her heart ache. She carefully returned the journal to where she had found it, but the verses stayed with her, echoing in her mind as she prepared dinner that evening. Elias had been less distant since their dance, joining her for meals without prompting, and occasionally initiating conversations about neutral topics: the weather, a documentary he had watched, her sketches of the lake. These small interactions, mundane as they were, felt like treasures after months of silence. That night, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rolled across the lake, Lila decided to take another risk. She built a fire in the stone hearth and arranged cushions on the floor, creating a warm nest against the storm's chill. On the coffee table, she placed 2 glasses and a bottle of Cabernet from the cabin's well-stocked cellar. When Elias emerged from his study, drawn by the smell of burning cedar, he paused at the threshold of the living room, taking in the scene with visible uncertainty. "What's this?" he asked. Lila looked up from where she sat cross-legged on a cushion, a book open on her lap. "I thought we might read together. The storm makes it perfect for poetry." His gaze sharpened. "Poetry?" "I brought some collections from Accra," she explained, gesturing to a stack of books beside her. "Wole Soyinka, Warsanshur, Odia Ofemun? I thought we could share favorites." Elias's hesitation was palpable, but after a moment he joined her, choosing a cushion at a respectable distance from hers. Leela poured wine into both glasses and handed one to him, their fingers brushing briefly during the exchange. "Do you read poetry often?" she asked, careful to keep her tone casual. He sipped his wine before answering. "I used to, not anymore." The past tense hung between them, another casualty of the accident, another piece of himself he had discarded. Lila opened her book, deliberately changing the subject before he could retreat. "This is Worcestershire," she said, "for women who are difficult to love." She began to read, her voice soft but clear against the backdrop of rain and crackling flames. The poem spoke of edges and sharpness, of being too much and never enough, of the courage required to love oneself when others found it challenging. As she read, Lila felt Elias's attention shift from polite tolerance to genuine listening. When she finished, silence settled between them, thoughtful rather than strained. "Your turn," she said, offering him the book. "I don't," he began, then stopped. "I haven't read poetry in a long time." "Then I'll choose for you." She selected another volume from the stack and found a page she had marked. "This reminded me of the lake at dawn." She handed him the book, open to a poem by Odia Ofemun, that described a landscape in the liminal space between night and day, the moment when the world held its breath before committing to mourning. Elias accepted the book with reluctance, but once he began reading, his voice gained confidence. The words flowed from him as if unlocking something long dormant, his natural cadence perfectly suited to the rhythm of verse. When he finished, he seemed almost surprised at himself, as if he had forgotten the sound of his own voice when not discussing work or exchanging pleasantries. "That was beautiful," Lila said. "The poem is beautiful," he corrected. "I just read the words." "No, it was your reading." She held his gaze. "You have a voice made for poetry, Elias." He looked away, uncomfortable with the compliment, but didn't dispute it. Instead, he took another sip of wine and asked, "How did you discover poetry?" "My grandmother," Lila answered, settling more comfortably against her cushion. "After my mother died, I stopped speaking for almost a year. The doctors called it selective mutism, a response to trauma." He traced the rim of her wineglass with one finger. "My grandmother tried everything to reach me, but nothing worked until she started reading poetry aloud every night. Eventually, I started reading with her, then to her, and finally my own words came back." Elias studied her, seeing her anew. "I didn't know." "Most people don't," she smiled slightly. "It's not something I share often, but I understand the power of silence, Elias, and the courage it takes to break it." The peril to his own chosen silence hung unspoken between them. "I found your journal," she admitted after a moment, setting down her glass. "I didn't read it, not intentionally, but I saw enough to know you write, or wrote." His posture stiffened. "That was a long time ago." "Words don't expire," she said gently. "Neither does talent. Some things are better left in the past." "Are they?" Lila challenged. "Or are they just easier to abandon than to reconcile with who you are now?" Elias's expression closed off, the fragile openness of moments before replaced by familiar walls. "You don't understand." "Then help me understand," she urged. "Show me one poem, just one, that you've written. Something that matters to you." He shook his head, rising from his cushion. This was a mistake. Before he could retreat, Lila spoke again, her voice steady. "I'll show you one of mine first." She retrieved a small notebook from beside the stack of books. "I write about things I can't say aloud. Maybe you did too." Without waiting for his permission, she began to read. "I wear your absence like a second skin, stretched tight across places you might have touched. At night, I count the spaces between heartbeats, wondering if yours keep the same time as mine. They say arranged marriages build love slowly, brick by careful brick, a shelter constructed against winds of uncertainty. But how do you build with a ghost who haunts his own house, who lives behind walls already built too high?" When she finished, the only sounds were the rain against the windows and the pop of embers in the fireplace. Lila didn't look up, suddenly vulnerable in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had written the poem during their second month of marriage, during a particularly lonely stretch of silence. "Lila." Elias's voice was rough. "I didn't realize." "How could you?" she asked, finally meeting his gaze. "You never looked." The truth of her words seemed to hit him physically. He sat back down, closer this time, and extended his hand for her notebook. "May I?" She hesitated, then passed it to him. He read the poem again, silently this time, his fingers tracing the words as if they were braille. "You're talented," he said finally, returning the notebook. "So are you," she countered. "I only glimpsed a fragment of one poem, but I could tell." Elias was quiet for a long moment, conflict evident in his expression. Then he stood and left the room without another word. Lila closed her eyes, certain she had pushed too far, broken whatever tenuous connection they had been building. But moments later he returned, the leather journal in his hands. He sat beside her, closer than before, and opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "This one," he said quietly, "was the last thing I wrote before the accident." He began to read, his voice low and intimate in the firelit room. The poem spoke of a man standing at the edge of transformation, unaware that his world was about to change irrevocably, the last moments of an old self before immolation into something new and terrifying. The raw emotion in the verses caught Lila's breath. This was Elias before fire had claimed half his body, before scars had rewritten his sense of self. And yet the poem seemed eerily prophetic, as if some part of him had sensed the coming change. When he finished reading, silence enveloped them again, heavy with unspoken connections. Outside, the storm continued to rage, lightning occasionally illuminating the room in brief electric flashes. "Thank you," Lila said finally, "for sharing that with me." Elias closed the journal but didn't set it aside. "I haven't read these since before." He gestured vaguely to his scarred side. "Why not?" "They were written by someone else," he said, "a person who no longer exists." Lila reached out slowly, telegraphing her movement, and placed her hand lightly on the journal. "The words still resonate, Elias. The voice is still yours, even if the hand that wrote them feels different now." He didn't pull away from her touch. "I don't know how to reconcile who I was with who I am." "Perhaps you don't have to reconcile them," she suggested. "Perhaps you just have to acknowledge that both are parts of you, the before and the after, existing together, creating something new." Elias looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing beyond her physical presence to something essential. "How did you become so wise?" A smile touched her lips. "By surviving my own fire." They remained by the hearth long into the night, sharing more poetry, some from books, some from Elias's journal, some from Lila's notebook. The distance between their cushions gradually decreased until they sat shoulder to shoulder, the warmth of the fire, matched by the warmth of connection, slowly building between them. When exhaustion finally claimed them, they fell asleep there, on opposite ends of the sofa, the poetry books scattered between them like bridges across a narrowing gap. Chapter 4. Third Signal. The Midnight Swim. The poetry night marked a turning point in their relationship. Over the following days, Elias began joining Lila in the sunroom in the evenings, sometimes reading, sometimes simply sharing the space in companionable silence. They still maintained physical distance, but the emotional walls between them had begun to crumble. One evening in late June, when summer heat lingered even after sunset, Lila stood at the kitchen window, watching the moon's reflection shimmer on the lake's surface. The cabin had modern amenities, including a heated pool overlooking the water, but neither of them had used it during their 3 months of cohabitation. A plan formed in her mind, bold, perhaps too forward, but she was tired of the careful dance they had been performing. If the poetry had opened a door between them, perhaps this could push it wider. She waited until Elias had retired to his study before retrieving a modest black swimsuit from her dresser. She laid it prominently on their shared bathroom counter, where he would certainly notice it, then took a lightweight robe and a bottle of wine with 2 glasses down to the pool deck. The night was perfect, warm with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. Stars punctuated the clear sky, their reflection mingling with the moons on the still water of the lake beyond the infinity edge of the pool. Lila lit the outdoor lanterns, casting the space in a golden glow that felt both intimate and dreamlike. Then she slipped off her robe and entered the heated water without her swimsuit, submerging herself to her shoulder. The sensation was exhilarating, a private rebellion against months of careful propriety. She poured herself a glass of wine and waited, hoping her implied invitation would be understood. 20 minutes passed before she heard the soft sound of the deck door opening. Elias stood hesitantly at the threshold, wearing shorts and a long-sleeved button-down despite the evening heat. In his hand was the swimsuit she had deliberately left behind. "You forgot this," he said, his voice carefully neutral as he averted his eyes from her bare shoulders visible above the water's surface. Lila took a sip of wine, her gaze steady. "I didn't forget." The implication hung between them, clear and unmistakable. Elias's posture stiffened. "Lila, I don't think," she interrupted gently. "Just be here in this moment. The water is perfect." His conflict was evident. Desire to retreat, warring with something else. Something newer that had been growing since the night they shared poetry. Finally, he set the swimsuit down on a nearby lounge chair. "I can't," he said, gesturing to his covered body. Understanding dawned on Lila. "You don't have to undress completely," she said. "But the water feels wonderful. Just come closer." After another moment's hesitation, Elias removed his shoes and rolled up his pant legs, then sat at the edge of the pool, submerging his feet and calves. It was a compromise, not fully joining her, but not retreating either. Lila smiled, accepting this middle ground. She moved through the water, to the bottle of wine on the pool's edge and poured a second glass, offering it to him. He accepted it, careful to keep his eyes on her face. "Tell me about Accra," he said suddenly, surprising her. "What was your life like there?" Grateful for his effort at connection, Lila began to share stories of her childhood. The vibrant markets where her grandmother would haggle over fabrics, the university where she had studied engineering, the friends she had left behind when she moved to America. As she spoke, she remained in the water, occasionally moving closer to where he sat, but never encroaching on his space. "I miss the thunderstorms," she admitted. "They're different there, violent but beautiful. My grandmother said they were the ancestors arguing over family matters." A small smile touched Elias's lips. "My mother had a similar saying. She called lightning God's camera flash, taking pictures of Earth to remember what he created." "I didn't know you were spiritual," Lila observed. "I'm not particularly, but I like the image." He gazed out at the lake, moonlight silvering his profile. "After the accident, I spent a lot of time wondering why I survived, when others in similar situations don't. If there was some purpose to it all." "Did you find an answer?" He shook his head. "Just more questions." They fell silent, the gentle lapping of water against the pool's edge the only sound. Lila finished her wine and set the glass aside, then submerged herself completely, feeling the water envelop her like a second skin. When she resurfaced, pushing wet hair from her face, she found Elias watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You're beautiful," he said quietly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as her. "I've never told you that, have I?" "No," she replied, her voice equally soft. "You haven't. I should have, it's the truth." Emboldened by his admission, Lila moved closer to where he sat, still careful to keep most of her body beneath the water's surface. "Would you come in, just for a moment?" Conflict again crossed his features. "The scars, they're more extensive than what you can see on my face." "I know," she said simply. "They cover most of my right side, from my face down to my hip. The right arm took the worst of it." His voice was matter-of-fact, but she could hear the vulnerability beneath. "They're part of you," she countered. "And I want to know all of you, Elias, not just the parts you think are acceptable." He looked away, his jaw tight. I haven't been in water since the hospital, the therapy pools." Understanding the significance of what she was asking, Lila moved back, giving him space. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize." To her surprise, Elias began unbuttoning his shirt. "No," he said. "You're right, it's time." Her heart pounding, Lila turned away, offering him privacy. She heard the rustle of fabric followed by the sound of water displacement as he entered the pool. When she turned back, he was submerged to his chest, his scarred right shoulder visible above the waterline. The damaged skin was a complex topography of healed tissue, some areas smooth and shiny, others textured with the unmistakable pattern of grafts. It extended down his arm and across his torso as far as she could see beneath the water's surface. Lila remained where she was, allowing him to adjust to this new vulnerability. "Thank you," she said simply. Elias nodded, his expression a complex mixture of fear and relief. "It feels strange but good." They stayed in the water together, maintaining a respectful distance but sharing the same space, the same experience. Gradually, Elias's tension eased as he rediscovered the simple pleasure of floating, of being held by the water. "Tell me something no one else knows about you," Lila suggested, floating on her back and gazing at the stars. Elias considered this, then offered, "I wanted to be a pianist before I went into technology. I played for 14 years. Do you still play?" He flexed his right hand beneath the water. "The dexterity isn't the same, but sometimes I miss it." "There's a piano in the boathouse," Lila revealed. "I saw it when I was exploring. It probably needs tuning, but maybe someday," he said, not a rejection, but not a commitment either. They continued to share fragments of themselves, favorite books from childhood, secret ambitions, small fears, and private joys. The midnight hour came and went, but neither moved to leave the sanctuary they had created. Eventually, Elias swam closer to where Lila floated, still maintaining a careful distance, but deliberately decreasing the space between them. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For this," he gestured to the pool, "the night, the moment, for not giving up." Lila smiled, her heart full. Some things are worth persisting for. Their hands brushed beneath the water, an accidental touch that neither pulled away from. For a brief electric moment, their fingers intertwined before Elias gently released her, not in rejection, but in acknowledgement that they were progressing at exactly the right pace. When they finally left the pool, Lila wrapped herself in her robe while Elias turned away. They returned to the cabin separately, but something fundamental had shifted between them. The distance remained, but it was no longer insurmountable. Just a space they were both learning to cross, one careful step at a time. Chapter 5. The Letter. The weeks following the midnight swim brought subtle but significant changes to Elias and Lila's relationship. They began sharing breakfast together every morning without prompting. Their conversations extended beyond pleasantries to genuine exchanges of ideas. Occasionally, when passing in the narrow hallway, their hands would brush, brief contacts that neither acknowledged aloud, but both secretly treasured. More remarkably, Elias had begun to relax certain physical boundaries. He no longer immediately covered his scarred arm when Lila entered a room unexpectedly. During particularly warm evenings, he had even rolled up his sleeves while they sat reading in the sunroom, exposing the damaged skin of his forearm to the ambient light. A small act of trust that hadn't gone unnoticed. The tentative connection growing between them felt as fragile as it was precious. Lila, aware of how easily progress could be undone, moved with careful patience, allowing Elias to set the pace of their gradual convergence. On a Wednesday morning in early July, Elias found himself alone in the cabin. Lila had mentioned driving into town for groceries and art supplies, leaving him with rare solitude. He used the opportunity to catch up on correspondence, sorting through a stack of mail that had accumulated over the week. Among the envelopes was one addressed to Lila in unfamiliar handwriting, postmarked from Accra. The international stamp caught his attention. She rarely received physical mail, conducting most of her communication with family electronically. He set it aside on the kitchen counter, where she would see it upon her return. Later, while searching for a particular report in the sunroom, Elias noticed Lila's sketchbook had fallen from the drafting table. As he bent to retrieve it, several loose papers slipped out, including a letter written on cream-colored stationery. He wouldn't have read it had the opening line not caught his eye. My dearest Lila, I still cannot accept that you've gone through with this arrangement. Elias froze, the words hitting him with unexpected force. He knew he should return the letter unread, but something compelled him to continue. Your father insists this marriage is what you wanted, but I remember our plans too clearly to believe that. Whatever obligation you feel toward your family's wishes, remember that your life belongs to you, not to tradition, not to business interests, and certainly not to a stranger who cannot possibly know your heart as I do. I've respected your requests for space these past months, but I cannot remain silent any longer. What we shared was real, Lila. 3 years cannot be erased by a ceremony with a man you barely know. The program at MIT still has a place for you. I've spoken with the directors, and they are willing to defer your acceptance another semester. We could resume what we began, pick up the threads of the future we planned together. I will be in Seattle next month for the conference. Say the word and I'll come to you. Whatever complications arise from breaking this arrangement, we can face them together. All my love, Kofi. The signature, perfectly legible, unlike the rest of the hurried handwriting, seemed to taunt Elias. Kofi, a name he had never heard Lila mentioned, yet clearly someone who had occupied a significant portion of her life, someone who had made plans with her, someone who knew her heart, someone who still wanted her. The revelation destabilized everything Elias had begun to believe about their relationship. The recent warmth between them, which he had attributed to Lila's patient nature and his own gradual opening, now appeared in a different light. Had she been comparing him to Kofi all this time, finding him wanting? Was each small connection they formed merely her attempt to make the best of an unwanted situation while her heart remained elsewhere? With careful movements that belied his inner turmoil, Elias returned the letter to the sketchbook and placed it exactly as he had found it. Then he retreated to his study, locking the door behind him, a barrier he hadn't felt necessary in weeks. His feelings surprised him with their intensity. Beyond the obvious sense of betrayal at discovering Lila's apparent secret was something deeper, more personal. Disappointment, yes, but also a sharp ache that felt uncomfortably like jealousy. When had he begun to care so much about what Lila felt? About who might claim her affections? The midnight swim and all that had followed now seemed tainted. Her patience, her careful approaches, her lack of demands. Perhaps these weren't signs of respect for his boundaries, but relief that he maintained them, sparing her the obligation of physical intimacy with a man she had never chosen. Hours later, the sound of Lila's car in the driveway pulled him from his spiraling thoughts. He remained in his study, listening to her movements through the cabin. The rustle of grocery bags, the opening and closing of cabinet doors, her footsteps passing his study without pausing. When he finally emerged for dinner, she had already set the table, a small vase of wildflowers at its center, plates of grilled fish and vegetables arranged with care. She looked up when he entered, her smile genuine but quickly fading as she registered his expression. "Is everything all right?" she asked, setting down the serving spoon. Elias took his seat, maintaining a formality that had been absent from their recent interactions. "Fine. Just focused on work." They ate in uncomfortable silence. The ease of previous days evaporated. Lila made several attempts at conversation, but Elias's responses were curt, distracted. Finally, she set down her fork. "Did something happen while I was gone?" she asked directly. Elias considered deflecting, but found he couldn't perpetuate the falsehood. "You received a letter," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "From Accra. I left it on the counter." "Oh," she glanced toward the kitchen. "Thank you." "From Kofi," he added, watching her face. Lila's expression shifted, surprise, then recognition, then something more complex. "You read my letter." "It fell out of your sketchbook when I was picking it up from the floor." A partial truth. "I saw the first line, understood, and decided to read the rest." Elias had the grace to look ashamed. "I shouldn't have." "No, you shouldn't have." Her voice held more disappointment than anger. She pushed back from the table and retrieved the letter from the counter, returning to stand beside him. "But since you did, perhaps we should discuss it." "There's nothing to discuss," Elias said stiffly. "Your personal relationships are your own business." "They become your business when they affect us," Lila countered, taking her seat again. "What exactly did you read that's caused this withdrawal?" Elias met her gaze directly, enough to know that you had plans with him, that you sacrificed those plans for this arrangement, that he wants you to reconsider. Lila was quiet for a moment, studying the letter in her hands. "Yes, Kofi and I had plans. We were close for 3 years during university. He assumed we would continue that relationship afterward." "You were in love with him," Elias said, a statement rather than a question. "I cared for him deeply," she acknowledged. "But love is a complex word. Yet you left him for this arrangement, for a marriage to a stranger." Lila's gaze was steady. "I made my choice, Elias, because of family obligation, because it was what I wanted." Elias scoffed. "How could this possibly be what you wanted? A cold marriage to a damaged man who can barely look at you? While someone who loves you waits for you to come to your senses?" Anger flashed in Lila's eyes, the first he had ever seen from her. "Don't presume to tell me what I want or why I want it. You've spent 3 months avoiding any real conversation about our marriage, and now you think you can judge my decisions based on a letter you had no right to read?" Her vehemence surprised him into silence. "Kofi and I were planning to apply to the same doctoral programs, yes. He assumed that meant we had a future together beyond academics. I never made that promise. The letter suggests otherwise," Elias said quietly. "The letter shows Kofi's perspective, not mine." Lila folded the paper carefully. "He was important to me. But when the arrangement with your family was proposed, I saw a different path, one I chose willingly." Elias shook his head, disbelief evident. Why would anyone choose this over a relationship with someone who clearly adores you, someone whole, someone without— He gestured to his scarred side. "Do you truly think so little of me?" Lila asked, her voice softening with hurt. "Say that I would evaluate a potential husband solely on his physical appearance? That I would be incapable of seeing beyond scars to the man beneath?" "I think you're kind," Elias said. "Perhaps too kind. Kind enough to sacrifice your happiness for family expectations?" Lila stood abruptly, frustration evident in her posture. "You're determined to believe the worst, aren't you?" that I couldn't possibly have wanted this marriage for my own reasons, that I must be trapped, or sacrificing, or settling. The evidence suggests nothing of the sort," she interrupted. "You read one letter from one person who saw our relationship very differently than I did, and instead of asking me about it, you've constructed an entire narrative that conveniently reinforces your own insecurities." The harsh truth of her assessment silenced him. Lila continued, her voice controlled but intense. "Kofi was brilliant and charming and ambitious. He had our next 5 years planned to the smallest detail, but he never once asked if those plans aligned with what I wanted. He assumed, just as you're assuming now." She moved to the window, looking out at the darkening lake. "I ended things with Kofi before the arrangement with your family was finalized. Not because of it, but because, despite his intelligence and his devotion, he never truly saw me, only the version of me that fit into his perfectly constructed future." Elias absorbed this, trying to reconcile it with the passionate letter he had read. "And this arrangement, did you think it would be different?" Lila turned back to face him, her expression softening. "I hoped it might be, that we might build something genuine, without preconceptions or assumptions, a clean slate." The irony wasn't lost on Elias that he had spent 3 months imposing his own assumptions on her, just as Kofi had done. "I've been unfair to you," he admitted quietly. "Yes," she agreed without rancor. "You have. I'm sorry for reading your letter. I'm sorry you felt you needed to hide that you had." She returned to the table, but didn't sit. "Elias, I know trusting is difficult for you, but I cannot continue to prove myself worthy of your trust if you withdraw at the first challenge." He looked up at her, struck by her grace, even in confrontation. "What do you want from me, Lila?" "Honesty," she said simply. "The same honesty I've offered you. If you have questions, ask them. If you have doubts, voice them, but don't retreat behind walls and expect me to guess what's happening." Elias nodded slowly, accepting the fairness of her request. "And Kofi, will you see him when he comes to Seattle?" "I don't know," she answered truthfully. "Would it bother you if I did?" The question caught him off guard. Not the inquiry itself, but the realization that yes, it would bother him deeply. The acknowledgement of that fact revealed something he had been avoiding confronting. Somewhere between their dance in the kitchen and their midnight swim, his feelings for Lila had evolved beyond obligation or arrangement into something more personal, something that could be threatened. "It might," he admitted, "but that's my issue to resolve, not yours to accommodate." Lila's expression softened at his honesty. "Thank you for saying that." They remained in loaded silence, the dinner forgotten between them. Finally, Elias asked the question that had been simmering beneath his surface since reading the letter. "Are you happy here, Lila? With this arrangement, with—" He couldn't quite bring himself to say, "with me." She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm not unhappy," she said carefully. "There are moments of connection that give me hope. Moments when I see glimpses of what we might become if we both choose to invest in this marriage." It wasn't a ringing endorsement, but it was honest, and strangely, that honesty gave Elias more comfort than false reassurance would have. "I want those moments too," he confessed quietly. Lila nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "Then perhaps we should focus on creating more of them rather than questioning the ones we've already shared." She extended her hand across the table, not reaching for him, but offering connection if he wanted it. After a moment's hesitation, Elias placed his hand in hers, the scarred skin against her smooth palm. "No more retreating," she said softly. "Even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult." "I'll try," he promised, knowing it would require dismantling defenses built over 2 years of pain and isolation. "But I can't guarantee I won't fail sometimes." "I'm not asking for guarantees," Lila replied. "Just effort." As their hands remained linked across the dinner table, Elias realized that despite the revelation of Kofi's letter, or perhaps because of the honest conversation it had prompted, he felt closer to Lila than before. The acknowledgement of potential obstacles had somehow made their connection feel more authentic, more grounded in reality rather than cautious politeness. The letter had forced him to confront not only his insecurities, but also the growing depth of his feelings for his wife. The recognition that he cared enough to be threatened by Kofi's existence was itself a revelation, one that would require careful examination in the private hours of the night. For now, though, the warmth of Lila's hand in his was enough, a bridge across the uncertainties that still lay between them, but one they were both choosing to cross. Chapter 6. Fourth Signal. The Storm. Despite their conversation about Kofi's letter, something had shifted in Elias. Over the following days, he maintained a polite distance, still joining Lila for meals, still engaging in conversation, but with a reserve that hadn't been present since before their midnight swim. He spent longer hours in his study and twice mentioned potential business trips that would take him away from the cabin. Lila sensed the retreat, but chose not to confront it directly. Instead, she focused on her own projects, sketching the summer landscape and cataloging the wildflowers that bloomed around the lake. She gave him space, understanding that trust, once questioned, required time to rebuild. A week passed in this careful dance of proximity, without connection. Then, on a humid Friday evening, the weather forecast issued warnings about an approaching storm system, potentially the most severe the region had seen in years. "We should prepare," Elias said over dinner, showing Lila the alert on his phone. "Power outages are likely. The road might flood where it dips near Miller's Creek." Together, they gathered emergency supplies: flashlights, batteries, non-perishable food, and water. Elias checked the generator, while Lila secured outdoor furniture and brought potted plants inside. Their coordinated effort felt natural, almost domestic, as if the prospect of facing a common challenge had temporarily suspended the tension between them. By nightfall, the storm announced itself with distant thunder, rolling across the mountains toward the lake. They stood at the living room windows, watching lightning flash on the horizon, illuminating the gathering clouds in brief electric bursts. "It's beautiful," Lila murmured. "Terrifying, but beautiful." Elias glanced at her profile, outlined against the darkening sky. "Like many powerful things." Their eyes met briefly before both looked away, the double meaning of his words hanging in the space between them. The storm arrived with sudden ferocity. Wind lashed the trees, rain hammered the roof and windows, thunder shook the cabin's foundation. Despite Elias's precautions, the power failed within the first hour, plunging them into darkness, broken only by flashlights and occasional lightning. Elias attempted to repair the generator connection, but returned minutes later, soaked from the brief exposure to the elements. "I can't fix it in this weather." As midnight approached, the storm intensified. Rain found its way through a small gap in the roof, dripping into the upstairs hallway. Elias placed buckets to catch the leak, while Lila gathered towels to protect the hardwood floor. "The ceiling in your room might be compromised," he said, examining water stains spreading across the plaster. "You shouldn't sleep here tonight." After a brief discussion about sleeping arrangements, Lila insisted on practicality. "Either we share the space sensibly, or I'll sleep on the sofa myself." Finally, Elias nodded. "All right, get what you need from your room." When Lila entered his bedroom 20 minutes later, carrying a small overnight bag with essentials, she found Elias had created a makeshift bed from blankets and pillows on one of the oversized reading chairs. The temperature had begun to drop as the storm pulled cooler air behind it. Despite the summer season, Lila shivered in her thin nightdress. "Here," Elias said, noticing her discomfort. He retrieved an extra blanket from his closet, their fingers brushing during the exchange, a brief contact that seemed magnified by the intimate setting. Neither acknowledged it, but neither pulled away immediately either. Despite the comfortable chair, Lila struggled to find a position that didn't leave some part of her exposed to the increasingly chilly air. Lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark white light. In that brief moment, she caught Elias watching her, concern evident in his expression. "This is absurd," he said suddenly. "We're adults. We can share a bed for warmth without complication." The practical suggestion surprised Lila, coming from the man who had maintained careful physical distance for months. "Are you sure?" "It's just body heat," he said, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Lila slipped under the covers on the opposite side of the king-size bed, maintaining the distance he had established. They lay side by side, staring at the ceiling, hyper-aware of each other's presence. "You're still cold," he observed, noticing her slight trembling. "A little," she acknowledged. Elias was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating with himself. Then, with evident resolve, he spoke again. "Turn away from me." "What?" "Turn onto your side, facing away," he clarified. We can share more warmth that way." Understanding dawned on Lila. He was offering to hold her, or at least to lie closer. She turned as instructed, her back to him, heart pounding with an anticipation she hadn't expected to feel. The mattress shifted as Elias moved closer. She felt him hesitate, then carefully aligned his body behind hers without quite touching, creating a cocoon of warmth between them. "Is this all right?" he asked, his voice low near her ear. "Yes," she whispered. They remained that way, not quite touching, but close enough to share heat as the storm raged outside. Gradually, the tension in Elias's body eased, and Lila felt herself relax as well, lulled by the rhythmic sound of rain and the steady presence behind her. "When I was a child in Accra," she said softly, "storms like this would knock out power in our neighborhood for days. My grandmother would gather all the children into one room and tell stories until we forgot to be afraid." "What kind of stories?" "Folklore, mostly. Tales of clever animals outwitting humans, ancestral spirits guiding lost travelers, ordinary people discovering extraordinary courage." Lila smiled at the memory. She had a different story for each type of storm. The gentler rains called for love stories, but thunderstorms like these demanded epics of transformation and rebirth. "Tell me one," Elias said, surprising her with the request. Lila began recounting a tale of a village maiden who ventured into a forbidden forest during a great storm, seeking medicine for her dying father. The forest, angered by human encroachment, transformed her into a tree as punishment. But through seasons of standing rooted in one place, watching the cycles of life around her, the maiden tree gained wisdom that transcended her human understanding. "In 7 years," Lila continued, "another great storm came. Lightning struck the maiden tree, splitting her trunk. But instead of destroying her, the fire released her from the bark prison, transforming her once more. Not back to the girl she had been, but into something new. A woman with roots reaching deep into the earth and branches touching the sky, bearing the marks of her transformation like sacred text on her skin." She paused, realizing the parallel to Elias's own transformation through fire. "What happened to her?" Elias asked, his voice betraying his investment in the tale. "She returned to her village, unrecognizable except to her father, who knew her by the light in her eyes that no transformation could change. The villagers feared her at first with her strange appearance, but slowly she taught them to see differently, to recognize that change, even painful change, can reveal truths that comfort never could." The storm outside had begun to subside, the thunder more distant now, the rain gentler against the windows. "Thank you for the story," Elias said after a long silence. Another silence, this one heavy, with unspoken thoughts. Then Elias's voice, lower than before. "I've been pulling away since Kofi's letter. I know. I told myself it was to give you space to reconsider, to ensure you didn't feel obligated to continue this arrangement if your heart was elsewhere." His words came slowly, carefully chosen. "But that wasn't entirely true. I was afraid," he admitted, "afraid that what we've been building might be real and therefore capable of causing real pain if lost." "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Lila countered gently. "It's moving forward despite it." The mattress shifted as Elias moved slightly closer, his body now just barely touching hers, his chest against her back, a whisper of contact that felt monumental in its significance. "I'm trying," he said quietly. Lila allowed herself to relax into the subtle embrace. "I know. So am I." Outside, the storm continued its retreat, leaving behind a gentle rain that pattered soothingly against the roof. Inside, a different kind of storm was calming, the tumult of fear and doubt giving way to something steadier, something founded on choice rather than circumstance. As sleep finally began to claim them, Elias's arm hesitantly settled across Lila's waist, not clutching or demanding, just resting there, a bridge across the final distance between them. She covered his hand with her own, a silent acceptance of the offering. They fell asleep that way, curled together against the chill, the storm passing, leaving the world washed clean outside and something new taking root within. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, as if the tempest had never happened. Elias woke first, momentarily disoriented by the warm weight against him. Sometime during the night, their tentative embrace had deepened. Lila now nestled fully against his chest, his arm curved protectively around her waist. Their legs tangled beneath the covers. For a moment, he allowed himself to remain there, absorbing the unfamiliar intimacy. Lila's breathing remained deep and even, her face relaxed in sleep. One hand curled loosely around his where it rested against her stomach. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating her features in a soft golden glow. With reluctance, Elias carefully extricated himself from their embrace, moving slowly to avoid waking her. He paused at the edge of the bed, watching her adjust to his absence, by curling more tightly around his pillow. The vulnerability of the moment struck him anew. This accomplished, brilliant woman, who had approached their arranged marriage with such grace, now sleeping peacefully in his bed, trusting him with her unconscious self. What had he done to deserve such trust? Very little, he acknowledged, yet she offered it nonetheless. The revelation left him both humbled and unsettled. He retreated to the bathroom, needing space to process the conflicting emotions churning within him. When Lila woke an hour later, she found herself alone in the bed, the impression of Elias's body still evident in the sheets beside her. She stretched, recalling the progression from practical arrangement to genuine embrace during the night. The memory brought a smile to her lips, another small step forward in their careful dance. Downstairs, she found Elias in the kitchen, preparing coffee and a simple breakfast of fruit and toast. He looked up when she entered, a momentary flash of something, uncertainty, anticipation, crossing his features before he composed himself. "Good morning," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Power's still out, but the gas stove works." "Good morning," Lila replied, accepting the coffee he offered. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and neither pulled away immediately. "How bad is the damage outside?" "Some fallen branches, a few missing roof shingles, nothing serious." Elias seemed relieved by the shift to practical matters. "The road is clear, though. I checked." A moment of silence stretched between them, the events of the night hovering unacknowledged in the space between their bodies. "About last night," Elias began hesitantly. "It's all right," Lila interrupted gently. "We don't need to analyze it. It happened. It was nice." Relief crossed his features, followed by something that might have been disappointment. "Right. Of course." They ate breakfast in companionable silence, the shared experience of the storm creating a new ease between them, despite Elias's obvious effort to maintain some emotional distance. When they finished, he cleared his throat. "I need to go into Seattle today. The storm damaged some equipment at the lab that requires immediate attention." Lila felt a flicker of concern at this sudden announcement. "Will you be back tonight?" Elias hesitated, not meeting her eyes. "Actually, I think I might stay for a few days. There's a conference starting tomorrow that I'd planned to attend remotely, but since I'll be in the city anyway," the explanation sounded reasonable, but Lila sensed an underlying retreat, as if the intimacy of the previous night had pushed him beyond his comfort zone, necessitating physical distance to regain equilibrium. "Of course," she said, keeping disappointment from her voice. "Will you need anything from here?" "No. I keep essentials at the apartment." He referred to the Seattle condominium they technically shared, but which had remained largely unused since their marriage, as both had preferred the seclusion of the lakeside cabin. Lila nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying, that he needed space, needed to process what was happening between them without her constant presence. "Drive safely, then." Elias packed quickly and within an hour was ready to depart. At the door he paused, seeming to search for appropriate words. "I'll call to check on you," he said finally, "to make sure everything's all right here." "I'll be fine," Lila assured him. "Just come back when you're ready." Something in her phrasing, the acknowledgement of his need for retreat without condemnation, made Elia's expression soften. He reached out, briefly touching her cheek with his fingertips. "Thank you," he said quietly, then turned and walked to his car without looking back. Lila watched until his vehicle disappeared down the winding driveway, understanding that this departure represented more than a simple business trip. It was Elias's way of recalibrating, of managing the vulnerability that had begun to develop between them. She would give him the space he needed, but she would also ensure he had something meaningful to return to. An idea began to form. Something that would communicate her intentions more clearly than words or gestures had managed thus far. Something that would require courage on her part, but perhaps provide the clarity they both needed. Over the next 3 days, Lila worked with focused intensity. Elias called each evening as promised, their conversations polite but somewhat distant. Weather updates, reports on storm repairs, mentions of conference sessions he had attended. Neither referenced the night they had spent in each other's arms, though it hovered in the subtext of every careful pause. On the 4th day, when Elias mentioned he would likely return the following afternoon, Lila put her plan into action. She began in the kitchen, placing a single sheet of cream-colored stationery on the counter beside the coffee maker, the first place he would go upon returning. On it she had written, "Elias, welcome home. This is the first of several letters I've written to you over the past months. Follow them if you wish to understand what has remained unspoken between us." Next, she placed a letter on the sunroom drafting table. This one, longer, dated from their 2nd week of marriage. "I watched you today from the dock as you worked by the window. You didn't know I could see you, and for once, your face wasn't guarded. You smiled at something you were reading, a full smile that transformed your features. I realized I had never seen you smile like that before. I wonder how many other expressions you hide from me. How many versions of yourself exist in the spaces where you think you're alone? Sometimes I feel like an archaeologist, carefully brushing away layers of sand to reveal something precious beneath, always aware that too much pressure might damage the very thing I'm trying to uncover. But I am patient. I have always been patient." In the living room, tucked between the pages of the poetry book they had shared during their reading night, she left another. "Today you laughed when I told you about my grandmother chasing away a monkey that had stolen her favorite scarf. The sound surprised us both. I think I've cataloged your expressions, measuring each small victory. The half smile when I bring you coffee exactly how you like it. The softening around your eyes when music plays that reminds you of better times. But your laugh, that was something new, something precious. I wanted to cup my hands around it like fireflies in a jar, preserving its light against the darkness you carry." On his pillow, she placed a letter dated after their midnight swim. "I saw your scars tonight, truly saw them for the first time, not as damage, but as a map of survival. Each mark tells a story of pain endured, a fire that sought to consume but failed. I wanted to trace them with my fingertips, to learn their topography as intimately as I've learned the contours of your mind, not out of pity or fascination, but because they are part of you. And I find that I want to know all of you, the places where you're smooth and the places where you're rough, the parts you display and the parts you hide. What you see as ruin, I see as resilience. What you hide as shameful, I recognize as triumph. You survived, Elias, and in surviving you became someone new, not lesser, just different. I wonder if someday you'll see what I see when I look at you." In his study, she left his letter, written just after their night during the storm. "I slept in your arms last night. For practical reasons, you said, for warmth. But I felt the moment when practicality gave way to something else, when your body relaxed against mine, when your breathing synchronized with my own. I felt you surrender, just for a moment, to the possibility that comfort might be worth the risk of vulnerability. You left this morning, seeking distance. I understand. What's growing between us frightens me too, though for different reasons. You fear being seen too clearly. I fear not being seen at all. You fear offering something you believe is damaged. I fear that you'll never allow yourself to offer anything real. But last night, for a few hours, we found a middle ground, a space where fear existed but didn't rule. I want to live in that space with you, Elias, for however long you'll allow it." The final letter she placed in the box of his favorite tea, knowing he would find it when he sought comfort upon his return. "If you found all my letters, you now know more of my mind than I've been able to express in our careful conversations. Words on paper have always come more easily to me than spoken ones. Perhaps to you as well, judging by the poetry I discovered. I have one final truth to offer. I entered this marriage with open eyes and an open heart, not from obligation or arrangement, but from choice. The reasons are complex and perhaps difficult to understand, but they are mine, and they are genuine. If you want to know more, if you're ready to hear the full story, meet me at this address tomorrow evening at 7. Beneath the time, she wrote Kofi's address in Seattle, then sealed the letter in an envelope marked simply with Elias's name. With her trail of breadcrumbs laid, Lila packed a small overnight bag and drove to the city, giving Elias the space to discover her letters without her watchful presence. She had taken the ultimate risk, revealing the depth of her feelings, her observations, her private thoughts about their shared months. Now all she could do was wait to see if he would follow where they led. Chapter 7. The Confrontation and Truth. Elias followed Lila's trail of letters throughout the cabin, each one revealing a layer of her inner thoughts during their months together. The letters chronicled not just events they had shared, but her private observations of him, his expressions, his moments of unexpected vulnerability, her growing understanding of his trauma. The final letter directed him to an address in Seattle, a meeting at 7 that evening. The drive passed in a blur, his mind replaying fragments of her written words. Her perception had been far more acute than he'd credited, seeing beyond his carefully maintained facade to glimpses of his former self. And, more disquieting, she had seen his scars, not as repulsive, but as evidence of survival, even triumph. When he arrived at the address, a modern apartment building in Queen Anne Hill, with views of Elliott Bay, his heart pounded with an unfamiliar mixture of anticipation and apprehension. A young man opened the door at his knock, tall and slender, with features that resembled Lila's. He wore designer glasses and a thoughtful expression that sharpened with interest when he saw Elias. "You must be the husband," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Kofi. Please, come in." Elias froze, the name hitting him like a physical blow. "Kofi," he repeated numbly, accepting the handshake automatically. Understanding dawned in the other man's eyes. "Ah, I see. The confusion. Yes, I'm Kofi, Lila's cousin, though I gather from your expression that my name carries additional significance." "Cousin?" Elias echoed, trying to process this revelation. Kofi stepped back, gesturing Elias inside. "Perhaps we should clarify a few things before you see Lila." The apartment was tastefully decorated in minimalist style, with large windows offering panoramic views of the bay. Kofi led him to a sitting area and offered him a drink, which Elias declined. "Where is Lila?" he asked, glancing around the open concept space. "On the roof garden," Kofi replied, taking a seat opposite him. "She asked for a few minutes alone before you arrived. But first, let me explain something about that letter you found." Kofi confirmed that he and Lila were second cousins who had grown up together in Accra. His family had moved to America when he was 18, and he had helped Lila navigate her transition when she came for university 5 years later. "The letter mentioned 3 years together and plans you had made," Elias said, confusion evident. "Academic plans, primarily. We were research partners during her undergraduate studies. We had applied to several doctoral programs together." Kofi smiled slightly. "There was nothing romantic between us, though not for lack of interest on my part, I must admit. Leela made it clear early on that she saw me only as family. Then why write suggesting she leave our marriage?" Kofi had the grace to look somewhat embarrassed. "Not my finest moment. When Lila told me she was entering an arranged marriage, I was concerned, protective, perhaps overly so." He leaned forward. "What I didn't understand then was her motivation. She had been looking for you, you know, long before your families arranged the introduction." This statement caught Elias completely off guard. "Looking for me? What do you mean?" Kofi sat back, considering his words carefully. "Your paths had crossed before, and the impression you made was significant enough that she sought to recreate that meeting. The arrangement between your families wasn't something she reluctantly accepted. It was something she actively pursued." Before Elias could respond, a door opened. Lila entered from a hallway leading to the roof access, dressed in a flowing sundress that complemented her dark skin, her hair adorned with small silver clips that caught the evening light. She paused when she saw them, her expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. "You're here," she said, her eyes finding Elias's across the room. "I found your letters," he replied, rising to his feet. Kofi excused himself discreetly, leaving them alone with the weight of all that had been revealed and all that remained to be said. "Kofi is your cousin," Elias stated, still processing this reality. "Yes," she confirmed. "I should have explained when you found his letter, but you jumped to conclusions so quickly and then withdrew so completely, I wasn't sure how to bridge that gap." After they settled on the sofa, Elias asked about Kofi's claim that she had been looking for him before their arranged meeting. 6 years ago, Lila began, I attended a guest lecture at Stanford while visiting American universities. The lecture was on theoretical applications of neural interface technology. I gave a series of lectures at Stanford that year. Elias recalled slowly. Yes, she confirmed with a small smile. You were the speaker. I was in the audience. She described how his presentation had impressed her, not just the ideas, but his communication style and ethical framework. She had asked a question during the Q&A and waited afterward to speak with him, but he had been called away. When she left her contact information with his assistant, it had been misplaced during a departmental move. So you applied to Stanford, hoping our paths might cross again, Elias surmised. But by then, I had moved on to private research. I followed your work, Lila continued. Attended conferences where you were speaking, tried several times to arrange an introduction. She smiled self-consciously. In retrospect, it sounds rather obsessive, doesn't it? Despite everything, Elias found himself laughing softly. Perhaps a little, but I'm flattered, I think. She explained how her academic interest had gradually evolved into something more personal. You were brilliant, yes, but also principled in an industry that often sacrifices ethics for progress. That combination was compelling. And then the accident happened, Elias said, the timeline becoming clear. Lila nodded, her expression sobering. I read about it in an industry publication. There were no details about your condition, only that you had been seriously injured and were withdrawing from public engagements. So how did we end up in an arranged marriage? When I learned that my father's company was exploring a partnership with your family's firm, I saw an opportunity, she admitted. I convinced my father that strengthening the alliance through a traditional arrangement might be beneficial. The magnitude of this revelation struck Elias with full force. You engineered a meeting. The actual arrangement was still our family's decision, and yours, Lila emphasized. You could have refused. Why didn't you tell me this from the beginning? How could I? Lila countered gently. When we finally met, you were so different from the man I had glimpsed at Stanford. Withdrawn, cautious. I realized that whatever connection I had imagined would need to be built from scratch, not assumed based on my one-sided history. Elias absorbed this, seeing their entire relationship in a new light. All those months, he had maintained distance, assuming Lila was trapped in an arrangement she hadn't chosen, when in reality, she had been the architect of their meeting. I need to ask you something, he said quietly, and I need the absolute truth. My scars, the changes after the accident. Did you know about them before our arrangement was finalized? Yes, she admitted. I saw photographs from a small industry event you attended about 6 months after the accident, your first public appearance since the hospital. And you still wanted this marriage, still orchestrated our meeting. Yes, Lila said, simply. Elias. I was drawn to your mind long before I knew your face, either version of it. The accident changed your appearance, but the essence of who you are, the brilliance, the ethical core, the perspective that first captured my attention, that remained unchanged. She reached across the space between them, her hand coming to rest lightly on his scarred cheek. The first time she had directly touched his damaged skin with such deliberate intent. I didn't marry your scars, Elias. Nor did I marry the absence of them. I married you, the whole complex person beneath both the damaged and undamaged skin. Her words broke through his final barrier, the fear that he was fundamentally unlovable, that he could be valued for his mind or appearance or achievements, but never simply for himself. With gentle deliberation, he covered her hand where it rested against his cheek, holding it there as he turned his face to press his lips against her palm, his first intentionally intimate gesture. I think, he said quietly, that I've been taking time for far too long already. The smile that bloomed across Lila's face was radiant. Does that mean you're ready to come home? Truly home? Not just to the cabin, but to us. Elias nodded and closed the final distance between them, bringing his lips to hers in a kiss that contained both question and answer, both apology and acceptance. When they parted, Lila revealed one final surprise. Kofi was organizing a conference on neural interface ethics, the very topic that had first connected them at Stanford. He had arranged for Elias to be invited as a keynote speaker. "Consider it my final signal," she said. "A chance for you to reclaim the public aspect of your work, if you're ready. And if not, that's perfectly fine too. Either way, I'll be beside you." For the first time since the accident, Elias felt truly seen, not for who he had been or might become, but for who he was in this precise moment. And in being seen so completely, he found himself capable of seeing Lila with equal clarity, not as an arrangement or obligation, but as the partner she had always intended to be. "Let's go home," he said simply, offering her his scarred hand. Without hesitation or shame, Lila took it, her fingers intertwining with his as naturally as if they had been holding hands for years. "Home," she agreed. Together, as they left Kofi's apartment, Elias felt as though he was truly beginning his life anew, not because fire had claimed half his body, but because he was finally allowing himself to step fully into the present, rather than clinging to the past or fearing the future. "Some connections are inevitable," Lila said softly as they waited for the elevator. "We would have found our way to each other eventually." Looking into her eyes, Elias found himself believing her, not just about them, but about the possibility of building something genuine from the fragments of his former self. Chapter 8. The Night of Courage and Reunion. The drive back to the cabin was filled with conversation that flowed without the careful guardedness of previous months. Elias shared details about his research that he had never discussed with anyone outside his professional circle, while Lila recounted stories from her childhood in Accra that she had kept private. The barrier between arranged spouses and genuine partners dissolved with each mile they traveled together. Night had fallen by the time they reached the lake, stars reflecting on its dark surface like scattered diamonds. The cabin welcomed them with familiar silence, but it felt different now, a stillness of sanctuary rather than isolation. Elias paused in the entryway, taking in the space with new eyes. "I should check for any remaining storm damage." "Tomorrow," Rula replied softly. "Some things are more important tonight." He nodded, understanding passing between them without words. They moved through the darkened cabin together, neither reaching for light switches, letting moonlight guide them through rooms that now felt unified by their shared presence. In the bedroom doorway, Lila turned to face him. For 3 months, he had ignored his virgin wife, until this night, wearing nothing, she would erase his fear. "Wait for me," she whispered, disappearing into the bathroom. Elias stood by the window, watching moonlight dance across the lake's surface. He thought about how many nights he had stood in this same spot, looking out at the same view, feeling utterly alone despite Lila's presence in the cabin. The realization of all he had denied himself, all he had denied them both, filled him with a strange mixture of regret and anticipation. When he heard the bathroom door open, he turned. Lila stood in the doorway, illuminated by moonlight, wearing nothing but her wedding ring. Her eyes held his, unwavering, filled with absolute certainty. "No more barriers," she said softly. "No more hiding." The sight of her standing before him, his wife, who had chosen him not once but repeatedly over years, awakened something profound within him. Not just desire, though that was certainly present, but a deeper hunger for connection that transcended the physical. "No more hiding," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. With deliberate movements, he began to undress, not turning away, not dimming the lights further, not trying to minimize the visibility of his scars. For the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to be fully seen by another person, trusting that Lila's gaze would hold neither pity nor revulsion. When he stood before her, equally exposed, equally vulnerable, a moment of uncertainty flickered through him, an echo of the self-consciousness that had ruled him for so long. But Lila's expression contained only warmth, as her eyes traced the landscape of his body, scarred and unscarred alike. "May I?" she asked softly, stepping closer, her hand hovering near his damaged shoulder. At his nod, she touched him, her fingers gentle but not tentative as they traced the ridged patterns of healed skin. Unlike the clinical touch of doctors or the careful avoidance of others, her exploration contained a reverence that transformed the act into something healing. "You're beautiful," she whispered. And though part of him wanted to reject the word, the absolute conviction in her voice made it impossible to dismiss. "So are you," he replied, allowing himself to truly look at her. Not just her physical form, but the essence of the woman who had pursued him with such patient determination in every way. When their bodies finally came together, it was with the unhurried certainty of those who had already committed themselves to each other in every way that mattered. Their physical union was merely the culmination of a connection that had been building since that first lecture hall 6 years ago, a recognition that had survived distance, trauma, and misunderstanding to emerge stronger for having been tested. Afterward, they lay entwined in the moonlight, Lila's head resting on Elias's chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns along her spine. The peaceful silence between them felt like a conversation in itself, one conducted in the language of heartbeats and synchronized breathing. "Look," Lila said suddenly, sitting up to gaze out the window. Elias followed her gaze and saw them, tiny points of greenish gold light hovering above the snow-dusted shore of the lake. At first, he thought they were reflections or a trick of moonlight. Then one floated closer to the window, its intermittent glow unmistakable. "Fireflies," he said with disbelief. "In January?" "Winter fireflies," Lila confirmed, her voice filled with wonder. "In Accra, my grandmother said they appear only to those who have found their true path against impossible odds." "Is that scientifically accurate?" Elias asked, the researcher in him momentarily asserting itself. Lila laughed, the sound light and joyful. "Probably not, but some stories have value beyond their factual basis." They watched the improbable insects dance above the frozen landscape, their lights blinking in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if signaling to each other across the darkness. "I spent 2 years believing that fire had destroyed my life," Elias said quietly, his arms tightening around Lila. "I never considered it might eventually lead me to something better than what I had before." "Fire destroys," Lila acknowledged, turning to face him, her expression serious but tender. "But it also transforms. It clears space for new growth. The question is whether we recognize what can emerge from the ashes." As if in response to her words, the fireflies seemed to intensify their display, their lights reflecting in duplicate on the glassy surface of the lake, creating a galaxy of stars above and below. In that moment, surrounded by impossible light in the depths of winter, Elias finally understood what Lila had been trying to show him for months, that beauty exists not despite brokenness, but often because of it, that scars mark not just injury, but survival, and that sometimes the most profound connections emerge from the very experiences designed to isolate us. "I love you," he said for the first time, the words emerging without planning or hesitation, a truth as natural as breathing. Lila's smile illuminated her face more brilliantly than any firefly could manage. "I know," she replied. "I've loved you for years." Beyond their window, the winter fireflies continued their dance, defying the natural order, just as the couple within the cabin had defied expectations and circumstances to find each other across time, tragedy, and misunderstanding. As they drifted toward sleep in each other's arms, Elias realized that the man he had been before the accident was gone forever, but so too was the man who had emerged immediately after, hardened by pain and isolated by fear. In their place was someone new, someone who carried elements of both previous selves, but was defined by neither. This new self, shaped by fire and healed by love, faced the future not with dread, but with anticipation, curious about what might unfold, but confident that whatever came, he would no longer face it alone. Outside, the fireflies continued their impossible dance, testament to a love that had found its way against all natural odds, a rare and precious thing, like light in darkness, like warmth in winter, like finding home in the most unexpected of places.